Yeah, and that leaves us in a big conundrum. I mean, if we just ended the show right there, it's a pretty bleak outlook here. Unfortunately, there's another side to this whole problem here, and you mentioned war to the last missile. Well, that doesn't just apply in the Middle East. That also applies in the Russia-Ukraine war, and in fact, that seems to be something that Volodymyr Zelensky wants to help accelerate because he's really keenly interested in those missiles.
Недостатньо засобів захисту. Особливо це стосується ракет для Петріотів. Ми усім партнерам довели і потребу, і головне можливість, як можна дати більше захисту життя. Це просто нонсенс, що в сучасному світі виробництво ще не налагоджено, настільки не налагоджено, наскільки реально треба, щоб був захист людей від балістичного терору. Ми давно зверталися і довели, що можемо виробляти, зокрема, і таку номенклатуру захисної зброї, якби Україна отримала від Америки ліцензії на виробництво Петріотів, нашого виробництва вистачало би і на захист України, і на допомогу партнерам, які цього.
So he's saying, and he has said in the previous few days, look, to all of NATO, forget about this 2027, because apparently there's already some contracts to give them some Patriots in 2027 that have yet to be built. He said, you know what, forget about all that. Give me all of them that you have right now, and then give me this additional ability to manufacture going forward in my country here. What do you think of that idea?
Well, he's also mentioning something else that I think is worth noting. In the context of what he was discussing, he was saying, what is wrong that the Western world is not adequately mobilized, its industry, its capabilities, its forces to support me, Zelensky. Now, I've never been a supporter of this man. He, like everything else associated with the Ukrainian war, is a fraud. I mean, this is someone, Kolomoisky, a famous Jewish oligarch from Russia, who then moved into Ukraine and established himself and made billions. He's now, I guess, sitting in jail somewhere. He's the one that found Zelensky, who grew up speaking only Russian, who was a comedian, not a Ukrainian ethnically, and certainly not by birth, and puts him in charge of Ukraine, with the help, of course, of the Newlands and Kagans and others. Now, these people created this fictitious government, and we have been backing it to the hilt, thanks to the CIA and the United Kingdom's MI6. And he's saying, look, you put me here. I was willing to try and get out of this with a peace agreement. You sent in Boris Yeltsin. He promised me the world. You haven't delivered. And what he's really saying is, if you don't give me everything now, I'm not going to be here in another year. And he's correct. He is absolutely correct. Now, there's something else that is never mentioned. That is that President Putin has exercised enormous restraint. He's always been opposed to any action that might result in the sudden introduction of NATO forces into the equation. He doesn't want a major war. He's handled that very well. But things are getting rough right now in this war, in the sense that the Russian people certainly have run out of patience. But we need to remember that President Putin also has enormous influence in Venezuela, in Cuba, even in Mexico. He has enormous enormous amount of influence in many countries. He could escalate the conflict that we've got going right now in Ukraine against him, and for that matter, what we're doing in the Middle East to destroy Iran, and move this horizontally into the Western Hemisphere. We are lucky that we've got President Putin on the other side of this equation. The problem is, somewhere along the line, President Trump seemed to promise some degree of flexibility, understanding, or agreement in Alaska. That turned out to be a complete and utter fraud. And I think that's begun to really change the situation and the attitude in Moscow towards us. It's not simply we can't believe in anything the Americans say. They're really the enemy too, just as much as the people in Europe. I think that's very dangerous, and that's why it is not impossible that we could see dramatic events over the next several months. The assumption that the Russians will sit quietly, gradually bite off pieces of their enemy. Now we've got these fortress cities that are falling, but not move beyond that, I think is a mistake. think it's very dangerous. This is a more dangerous period right now than perhaps any that we've seen to this point. So I don't know which particular conflict blows up in our faces first, whether it's Iran or Ukraine, and I don't exclude trouble in the Caribbean with Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico. But nobody seems to be focused on any of those things. Nobody sees any connectivity between those things. And we really ought to. There's more going on than we realize, and we don't have control over what's happening in our own country. And that's another matter. We haven't even talked about economics. And you can bring on Jeff Curry, who knows more about the oil market and oil trade than anybody, but you can bring on any number of people beyond him. No one can predict with absolute certainty, but we know we're headed for an emergency set of circumstances between now and the fall in the oil markets. That's going to have an impact here at home as well. Is anybody really thinking that through? Or is President Trump absolutely convinced that he can simply manipulate these markets in perpetuity? Because we're running out of the oil to do it. Now, maybe that'll change and, sun will break through and suddenly all the bad weather will go away. I don't know, but I think there are too many variables. There's too much potentially bad that could go wrong. But no one seems to tie that together in any sort of meaningful way.
And something that's just not auguring well for this sun to be broken through or for us to suddenly discover sanity. Obviously, President Trump does, by all accounts, think that he can, into perpetuity, manipulate the markets, in the paper market that he can manipulate somehow will translate into the physical market. That's probably not going to happen. But that mentality translates into the war itself, in the Russia-Ukraine war. And let me just show you, this is kind of a mainstream view. You might not have even heard of this guy, Andrew Harding, who was on Fox News, talking about how the mainstream sees this war right here. And I think this illuminates an even bigger problem.
I think if any president is going to ensure both sides come together, it's going to be President Trump. That's not to say that any type of ceasefire or a pause in fighting is easy. Clearly, it hasn't been. But the president has a strong track record, certainly the second administration, in securing pauses in fighting, ceasefires, even long-term stoppages in fighting between different countries around the world or different parties around the world, whether that's with Israel and Hamas, that's India and Pakistan, or certainly more recently with the United States and Iran here. The president is very much focused on seeing diplomacy prevent conflict from becoming bigger issues.
No, I've aside from just the insanity of that, there has been, because President Trump said it a couple of days ago, that he still wants a diplomatic end, and I think we're going to get it. He said, I think we're on. I got on the phone on the 4th of July with President Putin, and I mean, you could have lifted that almost verbatim from January 21st of last year when he took over and said the same things. And 18 months later, nothing happens. And people still keep listening to them. And then this guy here, I think he's probably talking not to the Fox News audience, but to President Trump himself, who obviously always watches this. And it's just feeding his ego that he can do all these things, and he's doing none of them. What are your concerns if Trump believes his own rhetoric?
I think we should send that young man down to Fort Benning, and he should spend some time in the I bar, and eventually someone will punch him out and throw his ass out. And that should end his career. He's pretty good help. It's pretty annoying. He sort of embodies in his appearance and speech and so forth everything I think is wrong with American manhood these days. There isn't much manhood. And he's willing to say whatever, the people that put money in his pocket say. Look, this is all crap. It all means nothing. It's all nonsense. Unfortunately, as we began this program, I said, most of my generation listens to it. That's the problem. Yeah. They continue to listen to it and they believe it. But everybody else has walked away. So I think once you get under the age of 50, you begin to see more and more and more and more people say, this is nonsense. This makes no sense at all. I don't want anything to do with it. I think the truth is that in the eyes of most of the electorate, our great institutions of governance are entirely lacking in legitimacy. And that's a very dangerous thing. People just don't believe what they're being told anymore. But again, if you're living in the bubble of Washington, D.C., there are no problems. If you move 100 miles west, south, or northeast, or northwest, you begin to get a very different picture. But unfortunately, inside Washington, the fantasy world is intact, and he's an example of it.